I'd like to begin by thanking Tom McDonough for inviting me to join you all this morning. I got to say, it's also exciting to see the portrait out and about this morning. I still remember my first night as a PhD student here at Catholic. I got my PhD here as well. That was 20 years ago. And I was in a class in the reading room in the archives, taught by Dr. Timothy Maher, the university archivist then, and an excellent historian of Irish American Catholicism. Dr. Maher pointed to the portrait that was in our reading room and asked, "Does anybody know who this is?" And half the class immediately said, "Karl Marx." Now, I knew enough not to know it would not be Marx, that we would not likely have a portrait of Karl Marx in our reading room at Catholic University. I didn't know enough to know it was Brownson at the time. And Dr. Maher explained to us that the very imposing man in the picture was Brownson. I got to say, Lord Acton actually also found him pretty imposing in person too. But that first night, that portrait just kind of hovered over my right shoulder the whole class. And I spent the whole class feeling intimidated by Brownson, and I suppose I still do, actually. And the reason for this is that I think that Brownson might be the most interesting person in the history of American Catholicism. He was at once a convert, a polemicist, a political theorist, and a restless intellectual pilgrim whose life mirrored the intellectual turbulence of 19th century America. And this might explain his place in American Catholic history. He's admired by diverse prominent figures like Russell Kirk, Woodrow Wilson, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., but generally he's underappreciated and unfamiliar to us. And I think a major reason for this is that he doesn't fit into a neat category. It's hard to put him in one spot. Actually, even against himself, it's hard to put him in one spot. He's a free thinker who found a home in a church that recognizes the importance of tradition. He's a Yankee convert at the time of Irish Catholic ascendance in the U.S. He's a Catholic who called for abolition at a time when abolitionists usually despised the Church of Rome, and when American Catholics were typically either in support of or quiet on the topic of slavery. He opposed both ultramontanism and excessive individual liberty. And he was a man of massive intellect who stayed true to his principles and his faith, even as they confounded his supporters and detractors, which sometimes went in different directions. To understand Brownson is to encounter not simply a Catholic thinker, but a man who attempted one of the most ambitious syntheses in American intellectual history: the reconciliation of Catholic theology with the American political experiment. Now, as President Kilpatrick mentioned, over the last month, we've had a number of events on campus exploring what it means to be fully Catholic and fully American. Our Leo lecture last week in particular did that. But I think it's appropriate to add Brownson to this larger discussion, because outside of John Courtney Murray and maybe Isaac Hecker, Brownson's sometime colleague, I don't think anyone has thought more about these questions. At the center of Brown's mature thought, and by mature thought I mean once he joins the Catholic Church, which is where he stays for the last half of his life, at the center of that lies a powerful and enduring claim that the United States has a providential mission. And this mission is twofold. First, it's political. The task of reconciling authority and liberty in a stable and just republic. Second, it's religious. The task of realizing in concrete historical life the proper relationship between the church and state, religion and politics. These twin commitments shaped Brownson's writings, especially his most systematic work, The American Republic, and they provide the framework for understanding his life, his thoughts on grace, and his evolving views on issues such as slavery. They also form the outline for today's conference. My goal over the next few minutes is to provide you with some general context about Brownson before you hear more in-depth presentations at later sessions. Brownson's biography, I think we all generally familiar with this, but it is essential to understanding his thought. He was born into poverty in rural Vermont in 1803. He grew up amongst Congregationalists, absorbing a culture marked by moral seriousness, but also theological fragmentation. And that is a whole different lecture if you want to deal with that. From an early age, he exhibited an intense desire for certainty, which led to an intellectual and spiritual restlessness that would define his life. His family moved to Ballston Spa, New York when he was 14, and the town was in the burned-over district, an area of New York that experienced intense religious fervor, revivalism, and missionary activity during the Second Great Awakening. A lot of utopian movements there as well. Given the intensity and variety of Brownson's religious beliefs in the first half of his life, I don't think he could have come from anywhere else. He's a product of that area. His first formal religious affiliation was with Presbyterianism, but he quickly rejected it because he was troubled by Calvinist doctrines of predestination. The idea that God might create some beings for damnation struck him as incompatible with divine justice. And that early break is revealing. Brownson's lifelong concern would be to reconcile divine authority with moral intelligibility. From Presbyterianism, he turned to Universalism, which denied eternal damnation and affirmed the ultimate salvation of all souls. He was ordained as a Universalist minister and became an active preacher and writer. But even here, his dissatisfaction persisted. Universalism, while morally appealing, lacked doctrinal solidity and the authority that he increasingly sought. His intellectual journey then led him through Unitarianism and into the orbit of Transcendentalism in 1832. In these circles, Brownson engaged with some of the leading figures of American intellectual life, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Theodore Parker, as well as broader reform and utopian movements of the 1830s. He became a prominent editor and essayist, especially through his Boston Quarterly Review, which would eventually become the Brownson Quarterly Review, where he addressed questions of politics, religion, and social reform. During this period, Brownson embraced radical democratic and even proto-socialist ideas. His famous 1840 essay, titled The Laboring Classes, pushed egalitarian principles to their logical extreme, advocated the abolition of inherited property, and criticized the emerging industrial system in the North. Brownson believed that true equality required not only equal rights, but equal conditions. This radicalism ended up being a turning point for him. Brownson had actually become President Martin Van Buren's man in Massachusetts. But the outraged response to his essay on the laboring classes has been called the primary reason for Van Buren's loss in the 1840 presidential election, most notably by Van Buren himself. This disappointment, combined with Brownson's growing disillusionment with democratic theory, led him to question the foundations of his belief, again, following his intellectual concerns in search of the truth and authority. And he began to believe that pure democracy, grounded solely in the will of the majority, could lead to instability and injustice. I will say during this period, his peers certainly noted his intellectual and religious wanderings, with Theodore Parker writing to a correspondent that he didn't know Brownson's current religious views since, quote, he had not heard from him for 8 days. But finally, Brownson's religious skepticism and journey had reached its limits. Having experimented with various forms of liberal Christianity and even secular humanitarianism, he came to a stark conclusion. Without a stable and authoritative source of truth, both religion and society collapse into confusion. And this realization is what leads him to his conversion to Catholicism in 1844 at the age of 41, which he never left, though it opened many rifts with his peers. Brownson entered the church, convinced that he had finally found the moral and religious authority he'd long sought. His conversion was not merely a personal religious decision. It was a decisive shift in his political and philosophical outlook. He didn't fully give up on liberalism, but he did move from a radical egalitarianism to a defense of order and tradition rooted in God's divine authority. And as always, he was ready to argue about it. It's worth noting here that the preeminent historian of American Catholicism during the second half of the 20th century, Catholic University's John Tracy Ellis, admired Brownson because he came into the church with strong backgrounds in philosophy, literature, and especially public debate. And he demonstrated habits of inquiry, engagement in modern thought, and a willing to challenge complacency that just wasn't found elsewhere in the American Catholic Church in the mid-19th century. I think Brownson's most enduring contribution to American political thought is his articulation of the American mission as the reconciliation of authority and liberty. In the American Republic, he wrote, "Its mission is not so much the realization of liberty as the realization of the true idea of the state, which secures at once the authority of the public and the freedom of the individual, the sovereignty of the people without social despotism, and individual freedom without anarchy." And this passage encapsulates Brownson's central insight. He rejected both authoritarianism and radical individualism, arguing that each represents a partial and ultimately destructive understanding of political life. The true state must balance these competing principles, securing both order and freedom. He elaborated further, the American Republic has been instituted by Providence to realize the freedom of each with advantage to the other. In other words, the American political system was not merely a human invention. It's not simply Locke's or Jefferson's social contract. It's part of a divine plan. And that conviction placed Brownson within a long tradition of thinkers who saw history as being guided by higher purposes. At the same time, Brownson is no naive celebrant of democracy. On the contrary, he's actually a pretty penetrating critic. He insisted that democracy was a means, not an end, and warned against the tendency to equate popular will with justice. He believed the government by the will, whether that of one man like a king, or that of the many, was mere arbitrary government that led to tyranny, despotism, and absolutism. And this critique reflected his rejection of the idea that legitimacy derives solely from consent. For Brownson, true authority must be grounded in a moral order that transcends human will. We are not enough. Original sin exists. And this led to one of his most forceful statements, that the will of God is eternal and immutable justice, which the will of the people is not. The people may do, and often actually do, wrong. Brownson rejected the idea that truth was subject to a majority vote, and instead insisted that both rulers and majorities are subject to a higher standard of justice. Brownson's second understanding of the American mission was religious. He believed that the United States had a unique opportunity to demonstrate how religion and politics could coexist with each other without domination or separation. Unlike European nations, where church-state relations were often defined by establishment or conflict, especially in the mid-19th century, the American context allowed for a new kind of synthesis. Brownson envisioned a society in which political life could be informed by religious truth, while the church would remain independent of political control. This vision reflected his broader philosophical commitments. He rejected both theocracy and secularism, and he didn't seek to subordinate the state to the church, nor to exclude religion from the public square. Instead, he argued that the two must be properly related, each respecting the autonomy and expertise of the other. And again, without that, you come back to authority, but without that transcendent source of authority, political life becomes unstable and prone to ideological excess. Underlying his political and religious thought was a theological vision shaped by his rejection of both Calvinist determination and secular rationalism. While he doesn't produce a systematic theology of grace, his writings do reveal a consistent commitment to the idea that grace perfects, rather than destroys human nature. And again, this plays into his understanding of politics. Brownson repeatedly emphasized that the social and political problems cannot be solved by political means alone. In response to revolutionary ideologies, specifically Marxism, he wrote in 1848 that the sufferings of a people spring from moral causes beyond the reach of a civil government. The statement reflects a deeply Augustinian insight. Political institutions can maintain order, but they can't transform human nature. True justice required moral and spiritual renewal. For Brownson, the church played a crucial role in this process by providing the moral framework necessary for political life to function properly. And without such a framework, even the best designed institutions will fail. I think Brownson's views on slavery actually do a nice job of illustrating this. Move it from the abstract into the real. They're illustrative of his thought. Like a lot of 19th century thinkers, he initially approached the issue through the lens of constitutional and political order rather than purely moral abstraction. Initially, Brownson opposed abolitionism, certainly immediate abolitionism, not because he defended slavery as a moral good, he doesn't, but because he believed that abolitionist agitation threatened the stability of the Union. This sounds like a Catholic philosopher to us, looking to maintain social coherency. He's deeply suspicious of movements that sought to impose moral change through political upheaval. And of course, it doesn't help that most abolitionists viewed him and all Catholics with suspicion, claiming that slavery and the Roman Church were the two forms of oppression that threatened the United States. But Brownson's position on slavery changes early in the Civil War. As the conflict unfolded, he became a strong supporter of the Union and came to see abolition of slavery as both a moral necessity and a political imperative. The war, in his view, created the conditions under which slavery could be justly and effectively abolished. He and Archbishop John Purcell of Cincinnati were essentially the only two public Catholics of the time who advocated immediate abolition. And Brownson even discussed strategy with President Lincoln in the White House. This shift reflected his broader principle that moral truths must be realized within concrete historical context. And I do very much appreciate a man who thinks history matters. He was wary of abstract idealism, but willing to support transformative change when it aligned with both justice and order. But it's worth noting that Brownson's principled stance during the war left him in a lonely spot once again. Abolitionists trumpeted his support for their cause, but they never fully embraced him. At the same time, his opposition to slavery cost him Catholic friends and readers of the Brownson Quarterly Report, and even earned him public rebukes from bishops, most notably Archbishop John Hughes of New York, who absolutely lit him up after a commencement address at Fordham University and left him basically by himself on the stage. This is a place where he and Spalding also disagreed. I think overall, one of Brownson's most significant contributions to American Catholic thought, and one that both John Tracy Ellis and John Courtney Murray would appreciate, was his insistence that Catholicism was not foreign to the American experiment. At a time when many Protestants viewed Catholicism with suspicion, Brownson believed that the Republic could not endure without a stable moral authority, and that such authority could only be found within the Catholic Church, which grounded justice in a transcendent order rather than shifting popular will. This is where natural rights actually comes from, in his view. That conviction places him at odds with a lot of people. Protestant nativists, Catholic accommodationists, and the dominant form of Irish immigrant Catholicism. Now, the first one's probably not all that surprising. At least I hope it wouldn't be all that surprising. But he does criticize Catholics who sought to dilute their faith in order to fit into American society, insisting instead that they should confidently assert the truth of their beliefs. At the same time, he was critical of the strain of public Catholicism that he saw amongst Irish immigrants and Irish clergy that made the church seem foreign in America, that embraced devotionalism to an almost superstitious level in his view, and refused to engage in broader American life. On the contrary, he saw Catholic participation as essential to the realization of America's mission. As I've already stated, Brownson's concept of the American mission was rooted in a broader philosophy of history. He believed that each nation has a providential role to play. Quote, every living nation has an idea given to it by Providence to realize. For ancient Israel, that mission was religious. For Greece, intellectual. For Rome, political. For the United States, he thought it was a synthesis of these elements. The creation of a society that harmonized liberty and authority and religion and politics. And this mission had to be realized in the concrete lived experience of the nation. For Brownson, the American spirit was embodied in the complex, unwritten constitution of American society and centered in the wide-ranging character and temperament of its people. History, not ideology, provided Brownson with his understanding of the American people. And he believed that the American Republic had already made significant progress in this direction, but he also recognized the dangers that threatened it. Among these dangers, he identified ideologies like radical democracy, socialism, and secular liberalism. Each in his own way, he believed, undermined the balance between authority and liberty. And each represented an attempt to solve political problems without reference to moral and religious truth. So I think for today, I think Brownson's life and thought remain a challenge to contemporary readers of his work. His insistence on the inseparability of politics and theology, his critique of both democracy, and his vision of a providential mission, a vision of a providential American mission, all run counter to modern assumptions then and now. But his central insight, that freedom and authority must be reconciled and that this reconciliation requires a moral and religious foundation, that retains its relevance. And the tensions he identified have not disappeared. And if anything, given the events of this week, they've intensified. We have seen conflicts this week. Brownson's legacy lies not in a finished system, but in a set of questions. Can a democratic society sustain itself without transcendent moral order? Can religion and politics be harmonized without dominating the other? Can liberty be preserved without sacrificing authority? The rest of today's panels will address these questions in more depth, with the morning panels looking at Brownson's understanding of America's political mission, and the afternoon sessions exploring his understanding of its religious mission. I do think these questions remain as urgent today as they were in Brownson's time. And his answer, that America's mission is to realize the dialectical union of authority and liberty and the natural rights of man and those of society, continues to offer a provocative and challenging vision of the American experiment. Thank you for your time. I do wish you all the best today with the conference. Enjoy the day. Thanks so much.